are listening to a free version of Majority Report with Sam Steeder. To support the show and get another 15 minutes of daily program, go to majority.fm, please.
Folks, you gotta protect your data. Behind the scenes, VMware's cybersecurity software is working overtime to ensure our virtual environments are safe and secure. DH Technologies and VMware are here to offer you a free demo of their virtualization software. Go to dhtech.com/demo. That's dhtech.com/demo to find out how to protect your organization today.
The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Thursday, June 29th, 2017. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the four-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. On the program today, Pokross Professor of Law and Social Policy, Director of the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University, Thomas Shapiro, on his book, Toxic Inequality, How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. Also on the program today, repeal and replace bribes are now on the table. Cruz offers a death spiral option. Rex Tillerson explodes as everyone under Trump, everyone wonders if Trump will even have a cabinet 6 months from now. Meanwhile, his lawyer, Jay Sekulow, now under investigation in 2 states for his profitable nonprofit.
Right.
Meanwhile, dawn shines on Marblehead. The center realizes it's not just Trump. Single payer dead in California for the time being. And Trump, Mika, and Morning Joe in a menage a dumb. Lastly, Trump administration sets up travel ban restrictions. Sorry, Grandma. If you come from one of those countries and you have family here, you're a security threat. All that and more on today's program, ladies and gentlemen. Let's get right into this. There's still, it appears to be the case that right now there will be no vote, like it appeared yesterday, no vote on health care until after the July 4th recess. However, there is also a massive push to get to a broad general agreement amongst the Republicans. I have been predicting since the other day, basically just as a function of what we saw with the House, that we're going to start seeing bribes. $200 billion worth of money. It's basically a slush fund that is not real dollars, but dollars that would be handed out in the course of crafting this legislation. Reported today by Politico, Senate Republicans in the White House have agreed to add at least $45 billion to their Obamacare repeal bill to address the opioid crisis. And that, of course, would be for Capito and Portman, maybe also in Maine for Collins, and our near agreement on allowing consumers to use health savings accounts money to pay for their premiums, that is for Ted Cruz. So as we mentioned yesterday,
But not a single word about Van Jones pulling the whole lid off the Russia story, which you and Rachel and Chris Hayes are so obsessed with covering. And by the way, pretty soon, my wife's going to send her regards to Van Jones. Are you going to cover it on the Majority Report? Wannabe MSNBC, as I call it? Hashtag fake news, hashtag not progressive, hashtag neoliberal shill.
Meanwhile, the opioid figure could rise. So they're looking to come up with a deal, at least a broad strokes of a deal by the end of the week. Then, so they can send that deal to the CBO. When they come back, they'll vote on it. Believe me, there will be virtually no town halls that these Republicans will hold. You still have got to pressure them. Let's go back in the Wayback Machine, ladies and gentlemen, to a time where Mitch McConnell actually felt like he had to get elected by his constituents, didn't have such huge corporate money backing him in Kentucky, and didn't see the destruction of health care really ultimately, though, for the sake of huge tax cuts for the rich, to be his single lasting legacy in the Senate. Let's go back to that time. It was a kinder time. It was the 1990s when he would put videos on the television like this.
When I was a child and my dad was in World War II, I got polio. I recovered, but my family almost went broke. Today, too many families can't get decent, affordable health care. That's why I've introduced a bill to make sure health care is available to all Kentucky families, hold down skyrocketing costs, and provide long-term care.
You don't have to be a doctor to deliver health care to Kentucky. Senator Mitch McConnell, on the job for Kentucky's future.
Yes, and he referenced that he had polio, I think it was, right? And that was, apparently it was the March of Dimes, which was a FDR private charity that helped him out. So
I prefer children that survive polio and then marry into Taiwanese trafficking families. But that's just me.
And now, of course, at that time, there was no Medicare or Medicaid, which it sounds like would have helped him out, perhaps. But be that it may, be that as it may, Mitch McConnell has moved on from all that and is now in the business of just getting massive tax cuts for wealthy people, and pretend like it's a healthcare deal. The one other little twist here, Ted Cruz is floating an idea that in addition to his health savings accounts, people perceive as another possible solution here. And that is to allow, to basically come to the compromise. You can have an insurance company, if they want to sell private insurance, individual market, they can sell whatever they want as long as they offer one plan that is Obamacare compliant. So in other words, we're going to offer, imagine if you will, you have a car lot and you can sell whatever you want and call it a car. As long as you sell one car that actually has an engine and brakes and functions once you get on the highway. What will happen? People will come in. Now just imagine everybody needs to have a car because they may need a car at one point. They walk in. The car that is compliant with everything that defines a car is much more expensive than the other ones. What's going to happen is people who know they're going to need their insurance, because many of us don't realize that we will until it's too late. But the people who know, the people with pre-existing conditions, the people who anticipate, I don't know, maybe who are older, they're going to attempt to buy the insurance that's actually functional. What's going to happen is you're going to have more sicker people who are going to buy that insurance. It is going to raise the cost of that insurance. And the delta between the actual good insurance and the crappy insurance is going to get larger. It is effectively the high-risk pool model. We're going to shunt all the people who are ill, provide them insurance, and we won't deny them insurance. We won't give them lifetime or annual caps. But it's going to be so super expensive. I mean, this may be the agreement they come to, but when it goes to the CBO, you're going to see similar, if not worse, numbers in many respects. Because the numbers, if you were to actually impose the idea of high-risk pools onto our healthcare system nationally are devastating. But that very well may do it. We may see this happen, folks. So continue pressuring these senators. Don't stop now. Don't stop over the break. All right, we're going to take a break of our own. And when we come back, we're going to be talking to Brandeis professor Thomas Shapiro about his book, Toxic Inequality, How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens our Future. We'll be right back. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report on the phone. It's a pleasure to welcome to the program the Pokross Professor of Law and Social Policy and the Director of the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University, Thomas Shapiro, author of Toxic Inequality, How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. Tom, welcome to the program.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So this is, we should say, is in some respects, I don't want to say a sequel, but I'm a fan of the 7 Up series of British documentaries, and in some ways, this is that of social policy, if you will, in this particular area. Just give us a sense of broadly speaking your methodology, and then I want to switch back into the policy implications, and then we'll switch back into the stories, because there's 2 books in one in some respects here.
Great, thanks. So one of the main databases in this book is a set of interviews that we first did with nearly 200 families in 1998 and 1999. The families are from 3 cities, half white, half African American, half working class, half middle class, half inner city, if you will, half suburban within each of those 3 cities. And all those families had young children about 5 years old, because we wanted to capture how the family wealth or lack of wealth was shaping their plans around their community, their schooling choices for their kids, and their own careers and their own networks. Luckily, that turned into a book called The Hidden Cost of Being African American that was published a little over 10 years ago now. And luckily, I was able to find some financing to redo that set of interviews. We wanted to capture them about 12 years later, when the kids, then 5, would be young adults, and either at the point of graduating high school, if they were on track, or to see what had happened to their lives in the interim. So we were able to get to a little over 80% of those families again in the 2010, 2011, and a smattering in the 2012 period. Of course, in the interim there, we had this awful natural experiment called the Great Recession and the housing implosion. So that provided another set of impetus for us in that particular study. So that's the basic. I like to tell stories, but I like to hang those stories on the real scaffolding of nationally representative surveys. So the stories tell us about the processes and why families are doing what they're doing, what they're thinking about, and be able to generalize from that. So that's the quick setup.
Yeah, and let's. I also want to touch on just the on your title, because I think over the past 5 or 6 years we've heard a lot about wealth inequality, but you both sort of qualify the nature of the inequality that you're dealing with in two different ways. One, you're saying that there is a particularly virulent inequality in that it's toxic, and also that the problem with inequality is not simply a social justice one, but a functional one for society. Walk us through those elements of that particularly toxic inequality.
Sure. So I wanted a title that was able to distinguish where we are now in the United States, and I would actually argue where we've been headed since the early 1970s, from our earlier points in time. And the distinguishing features for me are really, it's several-fold. Toxic inequality really is an unprecedented convergence of historic highs in inequality in both income and wealth, and that's pretty well known and extremely well and compellingly documented. But that's also combined with the United States being in an era of stalled family mobility, where economic mobility, to the extent it still exists, has gotten to the anemic stage, shall we say, and families are really having to navigate that by literally putting more paid workers in the workforce just to try and stay in the same spot. Those intersect with a widening racial wealth gap, which is something I have been doing a lot of work, both on the scholarly side and on the advocacy activist side for a couple of decades now. That racial wealth gap, the way we look at it and measure it, following the same set of families, has tripled between 1984 and 2013. All of those, if you will, against the backdrop of changing racial and ethnic demographics in the United States and increasing pandering to racial anxiety. And that, for me, is what distinguishes where we are in the United States today. And I don't want anybody to quote me, but in a way, inequality is not the issue. Inequality is always with us. The issue, it seems to me, is the threshold, the danger, how it comes about, and the segments of society that face it. So that's why I wanted to distinguish it and come up with the phrase toxic inequality.
And certainly in the post-Civil War era, well, I don't know if this is the case, but the idea that from 1984 to now we have seen a racial inequality wealth gap increase at that rate seems to me to be, put that in context in American history, because, obviously, when you're talking pre-Civil War, pre-Reconstruction, but I would imagine like the rate of increase over the course of 30 years, that seems to me to be pretty stunning.
It is, and I think there are really two main facets of that, if you will. One is, if as a scholar, if you will, if you were to take the hypothetical question of, all right, so mid-1980s, we're 20 years after major, hard-fought, successful national pieces of civil rights legislation around finances, around housing, around businesses, around access to higher education. One might presume, as some people do, that the United States has become that post-racial society where race has less and less meaning in terms of families and individuals' outcome. But when we put that to the empirical test and ask the question, well, what's happened to the racial wealth gap? If the post-racial society contingent is correct, then whatever legacy, whatever history is delivered at that gap in the mid-1960s should have stayed about relatively equal. The gap shouldn't increase or shouldn't narrow in any one way or another. But the data tell a very different story, literally looking at the same set of families, and that's what's key here, the same set of families, that racial wealth gap grows in inflation-adjusted dollars from $84,000 in 1984 to $245,000 in 2013. And what that represents to me is that when we talk about material racial injustice in the United States, history and that legacy is really critical, but we also have to understand the contemporary drivers of it in terms of policy, in terms of our own continuing institutional discrimination in the United States. And the other part of that is that while that gap grows, the financial wealth of African American families in that same 29-year period does in fact grow. So there's success. It's not as if there's a stalling out, if you will, but the fact is that the wealth of the white community grows so much more quickly that gap actually widens threefold.
And I would imagine that's going to affect purchasing power too on some level, right? Or is that controlled?
Yeah, you're right. It does affect purchasing power very, very greatly.
Okay.
Because we're talking about so-called discretionary income and how that's converted to wealth or not.
So the story that you tell is about intergenerational wealth in some respects. But I imagine over the course, when we're talking about 30 some odd years, is that a function of how much wealth is tied into housing? And I mean, it seems to me that there's like sort of it's a combination of both the impact of how you're set up with intergenerational wealth and how so often that wealth is a function of housing, and then what has happened to housing over the past 30 some odd years.
Sure, that's pretty much right on. I think a baseline piece of information here is that for the broad swath of, we can call middle-class America between the 20th and 80th percentile, where most of us are, 2/3 of the wealth of that broad 60% in the middle is in the form of housing equity. It's not the fable that we're taught in Economics 101 about marginal propensities to save and consume and thrift and all that, which is important for sure. But when you're talking about 2/3 of the wealth is in our home equity, that points us to the institutions and the regulations and the financing around home ownership in the United States, and the ways in which families receive help on their down payment, and the ways in which that wealth can be passed along to subsequent generations.
And just broadly speaking, just the way our society sorts itself in some respects, or is helped along to sort itself, like you say, by these policies. And I want to get to some major examples of that historically that have sort of begun that trend. I mean, I had one experience that where I became sort of aware of the implications of intergenerational wealth, but in a sort of bastardized way. And I don't know. I wanted to get your take on it before we go to some of those policy things. Because I had an opportunity to sit on a panel once on a weekend cable show with a guy named Donahue Peebles, who is one of the top, I guess, wealthiest African Americans in the country. And between breaks, we were having an argument about the estate tax. And he was saying that the CBE, the Congressional Black Caucus, CBC, supported, this was back in 2012, I think, going back to either Bush era estate tax, and he was putting it in the form of we have finally arrived, speaking of African Americans, we need the ability to pass down our wealth to our through generational. This is a major problem. And I thought, like, yes, that is a major problem, but it's not going to be solved by just making your family rich, your kids rich. But that is, I mean, so he was half right, it seems to me. The solution, though, is more, the estate tax is not going to be one that's going to broadly help everyone, is it?
No, no, it's not. So we could that rings one of my most passionate bells here, because the estate tax is so symbolic, and the way the current administration and past administrations have monkeyed around with it and tried to get rid of it. So the fact of the matter is, $10.4 million can be passed along tax free from a couple to decedents in any fashion and any form that they desire. Literally zero tax on that. And so $10.4 million for an individual, it's like $5.2 million now, and that's indexed to inflation because we have to protect rich people after all, and their sons and daughters and grandchildren. And even then, the tax I believe is now at a 35% estate tax level, and that's for $1 over the 10.4 million.
Right.
It's not of that 10.4 million. So to begin with, in communities that have not had historical opportunities to acquire and generate and build much wealth in the past, there is still ample opportunity to pass along a huge lot of it to descendants. Now, the second part of that for me is that, who are we talking about in the estate tax? 18 out of every 10,000 deaths in the United States are eligible to pay the estate tax. That's what we're talking about, 18 out of 10,000. And it becomes this huge national issue, which I think, unfortunately, we're about to deal with it once again in the United States under Trump.
All right, so let's go to some of the major policy examples historically. I think, this audience, I hope by now, is aware of the dynamic that took place in launching Social Security, but walk us through that on how that inhibited the wealth of African Americans and Latinos at that time, and this, of course, ripples throughout. But then I want you to talk about the tax code broadly and also the Federal Housing Agency.
Yeah, sure. So let me go with the last part first, because I think that's actually key to the setup here. The Federal Housing Act, passed in 1934, implemented in 1935, changed the rules upon which housing could be financed in the United States, and we don't need to maybe go into all that at the moment. But it essentially provided the ability for relatively low-cost loans over a long period of time, 25 to 30 years, and that's what changed the rules on how individual families could buy homes in the United States.
Prior to that, you had to put down 90%, all of
90% in cash, 90% in cash, and come up with the other 5 or 10% on a short-term five-year note that was all due at the end. So it's not a surprise maybe that we also have the Great Depression going on too. So let's not exclude that. It's not surprising then that the home ownership rate in the United States starts to zoom with the post-World War II economic prosperity and the implementation of the Federal Housing Act. And that's how, in my estimation, the broad middle class in America accumulates wealth. It's primarily, as I said before, through housing equity. And that's where the huge amount of net wealth of America's middle class comes from. And so that's about policy. That's about fundamental policy. And we could, I could make the case that it's actually great social policy. It's great public policy, except for that it largely, by custom and by law, excluded African Americans and Hispanics from the opportunity of becoming homeowners in the United States. Residential segregation is still the law of the land in most places at that point in time. We have examples like the Levitt towns, where a number of groups were excluded by custom, and it was written into the title and all that. All right, so the greatest, other than the Homestead Acts perhaps, the greatest property-owning opportunity and wealth-generating opportunities in the United States are closed off. They're blocked to large swaths of minorities in the United States. Social Security is passed about the same time, and this, you mentioned this may be more familiar to your audience, and we're trying to keep lifting this one up. When Social Security is passed, there is historians will argue a little bit, but there's essentially a deal that's made to get the support of Southern Democrats, and the deal is that it will be, quote, and use the air quotes here, it's, quote, universal, except that certain occupations will be excluded, and those occupations were written into the law to be excluded, and they were domestic workers, railroad workers for a different reason, and agricultural and farm workers. And who were they? African Americans and Hispanics. So literally from mid-1930s, where this so-called universal system is built for senior economic security and disability, and descendants of workers who die too early or get disabled and can't work too early in their lives, that system is built and works pretty well for the most part for those occupations which are filled largely by white workers, white male workers, but doesn't work very well for female workers, for African Americans and Hispanics. It's not until the 1960s, for example, through the great work of Cesar Chavez and the United Farm Workers, that agricultural workers get reformed and brought into the Social Security structure. So you've got generations now of minority workers that don't have retirement security, which means that there's no protection for any savings they might have built up. They have to spend that in their old age in comparison to other workers that were a great part of the system.
So they have no ability to pass anything on to their children, A. B, their children may in some instances have responsibility to pay for, or to house or to take care of these people to keep them out of poverty. So it inhibits their ability to build wealth. I mean, and you
Absolutely.
It's just a ripple that continues through time.
Absolutely. That's, as a sociologist, that's what we call a pattern, a system, a social structure, if you will. The third part that you brought up is in the tax code. And while Social Security and the Federal Housing Act might seem like somewhat distant history, although I would argue their legacy still is very much alive today, the tax code is very contemporary. And the tax code actively redistributes wealth to the top. And an example, since we're talking about housing, essentially, among other things, let's stick with the example of housing. One of the largest public investments in the tax code is the mortgage interest deduction, which operates in such a way that you're eligible to take the interest you pay on your mortgage off of your taxes. So the higher the tax bracket you're in, the more of the interest that you can take off. The more expensive the home and the mortgage is, the more you can take off. And all of that operates in a way that we invest as a society about $150 billion every single year, not a one-off, but every single year in the mortgage interest deduction and 2 or 3 other items that are very closely related, like not having to pay property taxes, like not having to pay capital gains when you sell your house, for example. All of those amount to about $150 billion every single year. It's one thing, Sam, to think about if that $150 billion were invested as a public good, somewhat democratically, somewhat representative to the demographics in the United States, we might think of it one way. But no, the data tell, again, a very different story. About 86% of that $150 billion every single year goes to the top 10% of income filers. A massive redistribution of wealth to the top. Now, a lot of people don't like the word redistribution, but they don't like it only when those of us on the progressive side, if you will, talk about it in terms of equity. But redistribution, in fact, is what happens every day through the tax code.
So just to be, to recap the sort of dynamic, when we're talking about just housing, which, like you said, accounts for 2/3 of the wealth of people between the 20 and 80th percentile. So essentially, to the extent that we have a middle class in this country, that's what we're talking about. Structurally speaking, you don't have multi-generations of families that have been able to get loans, get the leverage to buy these homes and to step up essentially over time and to hand these down. Plus, on that end, you're then subsidizing the paying off of those loans that these people couldn't get in the first place. So there's really sort of like a double dip here, right? In terms of if you see it as a race or as a climbing up the ladder, if you will, that inhibit just on the financing side alone, right? I mean, this is we're not even talking about the difficulty or the social. And I would like you to talk about this because, and I'd like to also talk a little bit about, the people that you met and your experiences. But, and maybe this is a good jumping off point to talk about how there is a tendency because of people making decisions that are just not as profitable based upon where their families come, insofar as, like, if I'm an African American professional, go talk about that, because I think you have a case about that in St. Louis.
Yeah, sure. So they're in Toxic Inequality, we're able to tell the story of a couple of those middle class and/or professional African American families that face a very, I don't want to say unique, because it's faced by millions of African American and Hispanic professionals and middle class families as well, because of residential segregation and the persistence of residential segregation in the United States, the valuing of equity through home ownership is color-coded according to the demographics of a community, so that we know, and there's a very ample both economic and sociological literature around this, that when a home is located in a relatively well-off, say upper middle class, relatively homogeneous white community, no matter when the home was built, the blades of grass, the square footage, the size of the yard, all that stuff, that home is going to increase in value much more quickly and of a higher ceiling on the value appreciation of that property than if that exact same home, same number of blades of grass, were located in a lower middle class community that's even 50% minority. And the numbers keep going, up or down. You slide them up or down from there. Realtors talk about how's the property valued, and they have the mantra location, location, location. Well, the deconstruct of that is demographics, demographics, demographics.
And we should say too, I mean, there's a whole host of factors that are implicated by that, right? I mean, if you're coming from if you're in a neighborhood that is predominantly or even significantly African American, historically you have a lot less political power in that neighborhood, and so you'll see services that are reduced. You'll see schools that aren't as well funded, and these things add to that property value equation.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty clear loop that goes on there. We know, very profoundly confirmed by the study after study after study. There's a very high correlation between community wealth, that is the value of property, the value of homes in a community, and they may not be great measures, but the measure of school quality. It's very high, and so it turns also that it's not just the community wealth that provides more resources, because schools, unfortunately, in my view, are financed 70% or so out of local property taxes, which makes that system extremely inequitable. But the better the school, then the other side of the loop is the better the school, the higher the property value. It becomes an asset for everybody.
Talk a little bit about the myths that are associated with people's understanding of generational wealth and whatnot. I mean, one of the things that I was reminded of in I think it was a story about how someone either bought a new house or paid for college, but was Mitt Romney talking about back in the day, like, Ann and I, all we had was a small stock portfolio of $60,000, and just sort of no idea that, like, wow, that's a huge asset to have.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
aside from the knowledge that your family can provide that, and the fact that his dad was, head of a major car company and the governor of Michigan. I mean, but talk about how, because this also reminds me of, there's a lot of times we reference the mortgage interest deduction as being part of that submerged state that has been written about, where people don't realize that they are getting government services. There's a sort of similar dynamic that people don't realize that they're getting an intergenerational benefit.
Yeah, so we like to half joke and say denial is more than a river in Egypt. It's easy it's sort of in our character, if you will, to attribute success to our own merit and our own achievements, and make that internal and to externalize failures to people or institutions or somebody else around us. We did an interesting exercise. I gave a talk last week in Dallas, Texas, and there were a little over 300 people in the audience, and the exercise went this way. We asked people to stand if they were homeowners, and it was largely a middle-aged crowd. It was mixed, but it was sort of predominantly middle-aged. So a lot of people are standing. The person running the exercise, this is just before a presentation I'm about to give, and she's trying to set this up for me. She says, all right, sit down if you received help on your down payment from family. A lot of people sat down. Sit down if you were the beneficiary of a low, a government guaranteed low interest rate. A lot of people sit down. Sit down if you have a college education and your family helped you with tuition. All right, by the end of this, and it didn't go much further, there were literally 4 people left standing in the audience. And what that showed, obviously not a national sample, but the dynamic was one that we get a lot of help,
right,
for especially for home ownership, and that comes through inheritance largely. We tend not to think of help on a down payment as inheritance. We tend only to think of inheritance as something that's passed at the death of a beloved elderly relative. But about 35% of Americans receive $10,000 or more dollars in inheritance over like a 20-year period. And that's a little over a third, so that gives us an idea. And 10,000 may not be a whole lot. It depends where, for Mitt Romney, it may not have been a lot, but I suspect for a lot of the listeners today, it's a lot. But that 35% hides a lot, and what it hides is an extreme racial breakdown, where 46% of whites inherit more than 10,000, and 10% of African Americans, and so that's a 4.6 to 1 ratio, right away. And then even among those African Americans, those 10% that do inherit, on average they inherit $30,000 less than the whites that are also lucky enough to inherit. So it's the history, because wealth can be passed, not like income, not like human capital, not like a lot of other things. One of the reasons that I really like the ability to analyze family wealth is that it is intergenerational, and we can track what is that legacy, what does that history look like from one generation to another. And the data I just gave, I would suggest, is history in motion. It's visiting us today.
Let's talk a little bit just about the relationship between class and race here, and I wonder, if you can also sort of break out for us the disparate impact on wealth building. And I should say also, I'd like to introduce the idea of that or mention your idea of an asset poverty line, so that we can sort of like begin to contemplate these things more than just simply wealth, but understand this. But where does it have more disparate impact between? Because you spoke to people both in poverty and living in middle class, both black and white. Where is the disparate impact? I mean, I think people get the sense of what the answer is, but the disparate impact is that much more.
Sure. So it's, our in the social sciences and in the public square, the conversations have been unfortunate in that we talk about sort of material inequality, whether it's male, female, black, white. For a long time, we've landed on individual or family income. I mean, the male female 79 cents on the dollar is a perfect example of that, and it tells a good story, but that picture is not complete by any stretch of the imagination, because we've left out that reservoir of resources, that individual or family wealth. So almost all the families we talk to, and this is true nationally as well, we use income essentially to reproduce our daily lives, to pay our rent or our mortgage, put clothing on our back, food, shelter, maybe some discretionary spending on entertainment, on vacations, etc. But the truth of the matter is that most American families are close to zero spending that income on reproducing their daily lives by the end of the month. Now, we spoke to a bunch of families, and if I can recall, I think accurately the phrase, one of the people we talked to said that the month was longer than the paycheck. And that, I think, is a good capture on sort of what happens at the end of the month to a lot of families, both black and white, that are close to that income poverty line at least. It's the family's wealth, though, that provides first protection from the unexpected, from emergencies, whether it's the air conditioning going out in the living unit in the dead of summer, or the car breaking an axle in a pothole in the dead of winter, or someone not being able to cover the hospital bill. There's got to be a reserve to dip into, and that doesn't come out of the weekly or the monthly paycheck. That comes out of savings or the coffee can or under the mattress or wherever it comes from. Wealth then serves a second function, and that's the function where it provides the opportunity to buy opportunities of higher education, home ownership, business development, retirement savings. And that's where we can get into conversation about the what I would call an asset poverty line as an analog to the traditional income poverty line. So when we ask the question, and it's a little, I don't want to say unfair, but the assumptions don't totally hold up. But if we were to ask the question, if a family's source of income was totally disrupted and they had no source of income, how many months could they survive out of their savings at the sheer government traditional poverty line for 3 months? And the answer is only about 40% of American families can. That is, the amount of savings that most American families have is not very much, and we're talking about $10,000 or less here. That's 40% or so of all American families, and that, of course, differs greatly by race and ethnicity.
And how does that play into?
That's how close to the cliff or fragile most American families are. The phrase has now become a little more popular. We're one accident away, we're one emergency away, we're one mishap away from being out of money.
And how does equity in a home play into that, in terms of like how you measure equity in it's one thing to not have the cash, let's say, over those 3 months. I'm only asking in terms of, because in the context of building generational wealth, it seems to me that even when you don't have some liquid assets, but obviously when you do, like your car breaks down, it's not just a question of can I get the car fixed, it's can I keep my job, right? Because if I can't fix my car, I can't get to my job, and then I've got to get a job, and my opportunities are limited, and then you start to actually, your mobility starts to move the other direction. So it can function, but it also can function beyond that, whereas if I have a cushion, I can go and risk this entrepreneurial opportunity, or I can, maybe risk my current job to go interview for a different job. I mean, there's just a lot more flexibility.
Sure. So there's a family. One of the families we write about in the book, the Ackermans in St. Louis. They both had pretty good jobs. Mr. Ackerman lost his job. He was running communications in 3 cities for emergency services. He was a sort of chief dispatcher and scheduler, and that's the work he did. And he was making pretty good money. He got fired or laid off when the sort of change of political administrations, and he was able to sustain that lack of employment for about 6 months without there being much disruption of the family's well-being, because his wife was still working, and over the years he and his wife had built up through a mandatory retirement system where both of them worked a little over $300,000 in retirement savings. So they had a big cushion, and I frame that, or I think of that. That's the way all American families should be. I don't want to talk about them as being, particularly greatly advantaged because they're white and where they worked, but that's a system that we want to build for everybody,
right?
In that sense, and that kind of protection, and that's pretty unusual these days.
And so, I mean, just speak to that difference, the relationship between class and race here, because that has become a particularly right now. Just give us your perspective on that.
Yeah, sure. So when we put wealth into this equation, it really jumbles it up even further, and makes the binary thinking that we tend to be stuck in, race or class, even more perhaps inaccurately framed than it might otherwise be. That's because I think our traditional, our ingrained ways of thinking about class is in the income mode. What we get paid, what the market pays us for the work we do, and that in combination with our education and the kind of job we have, again, really rooted, grounded in the marketplace, where wealth is partially grounded in the workplace, but it's really grounded in maybe more so in property, in ownership, in a different kind of power in that way. So we think of class primarily just through that contemporary market mode, and when we cut wealth in, this is the way I like to phrase it, if you will. If we define class in terms of wealth and not income, we get a very different picture. First of all, you get the huge majority of Americans that are poor, wealth poor, a lower middle class, a very, very little wealth to play with, maybe just that emergency level of wealth, and a pretty tiny minority that are at the top of a very different looking pyramid. In addition, when we intersect the race dynamics, this is the analog that happens here. The wealth of an African American professional, a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, is about the same as a skilled white worker, and those are not, if you think in terms of traditional class terms, well, the income of professionals is much greater than skilled workers, especially those that are not unionized, and that gives us that jumbles up kind of the race class conversation even more. So for me, to come to some kind of somewhat succinct theoretical statement, if you will, the historical intersection of race and class is really built on our history, where to some degree it's race that's lifting class up, and they don't mix in quite the same way when we think about financial wealth and family wealth in that way.
So just to be clear, if I am, and obviously broadly speaking, but if I am an African American doctor, my wealth is more likely to be equivalent to a white factory worker, let's say.
Yes.
Or okay.
Yes.
And
yes.
And that
even though your income can be 2 or 3 times.
And that's because I'm more likely, if I am the white factory worker, to have inherited either money or a home, or I was given a small stake
Yep.
That I was able to leverage. Okay. I mean, that
and the Sam and the African American professional, we know a higher rate of African American college graduates have student loans, and the student loans they have on average are actually larger. And the cultural part I would throw in here, because it's part of what we learned through interviewing the families and other projects that we work on here, is that when a minority member, whether it's Hispanic, African American, or whatever, when they're the most successful in their network, they tend very much to be the family members that other less fortunate family members call upon for resources in times of need, whether it's helping a niece or a nephew to get to community college. They take care, and we know this through the data, it's absolutely accurate. A higher proportion of African Americans and Hispanics give money to elderly parents and other relatives. And at the end of the day, that makes their wealth look lower, but it's because they've used it for purposes and values that I would suggest are highly appropriate. Where that white person, their other members, it's more spread out.
Right, they don't have the same. They're not called upon to be
not nearly to the same
the
extent.
hero for the family in the same way.
Right.
Right. All right. So the gist of all of this is that these are policy decisions that have been made over the course of generations that have brought us to this point. And you list a bunch of policy recommendations, but pick out the top 2 or 3 that you, if we were living in a slightly different era, could implement, or if you were perhaps maybe just I don't know, king for the week.
Sure. So
and lock these
let's,
in such a way that they can't be reversed easily.
So some kind of sustainability. So you and I get to be king and or queen for the week here.
Thank you.
And what we get to do is that I'll just start with how, because that's the biggest driver. It's also because where most of our conversation has been today. I don't know how many listeners you've got. I assume it's a lot. With a very few exceptions, we could put all of us in a football stadium, and within half an hour, we could redesign the mortgage interest deduction, keeping the $150 billion. I do not want to lose sight of losing that. It's a public good. Let's repurpose it in a way that it actually reaches families that need help on their housing, not just home ownership, but housing stability. We could repurpose and redesign that within a half hour.
And so, I mean, from a political,
we could put a ceiling. Second, third homes could not be eligible.
Okay.
We could make it flat where everybody gets the same amount. There are a bunch of relatively easy things to do in theory.
Well, let me ask you. Let me just, because this is like, you hear a lot about the repeal of it, and then you also hear like that would be there's so many interests that are would guard that specific tax in particular. I mean, because one has to imagine that it would also not just have the impact of repurposing that money, right? Like we're not going to subsidize wealthy people to buy, second house. We're not going to subsidize McMansions and whatnot if we do it there. But it's also going to, in somewhat, I don't think depress is the right word, but it's going to certainly slow the acceleration of the value of the increase in value on these homes, right? Because so much of the way people approach buying a home is a function of that monthly payment. And that monthly payment is calculated, I mean, I think particularly for more sophisticated, and wealthier people who have an accountant to do this. Like, okay, your loan is going to be, I don't know, $1,500 a month, but in fact, it's really going to be $1,200 a month, and that's going to be cheaper than your rent or something, right?
That's what the realtor does when the realtor tells you how much the home is going to cost per month, and you say that I can't swing that in the budget. That's the first thing the realtor does. Is remember, you're in the 36% tax bracket, so this is the interest you pay, and 36% of that you're going to get back at tax time, and that's the way it's kind of sold.
And then that increases the cost of the house, right? Because your monthly payments are that much lower.
That's correct. So I would, we're just at the point of starting to do some modeling on this. So I'm going to be, unfortunately, a little speculative. I can't cite the data at this point. I'm pretty well convinced that the data and the evidence will show that there will be no decrease in the rate of home ownership at all. In fact, there might even be an increase. It will be a shift of the balance where more affordable home ownership will happen, at the expense, if you will, of the McMansion. So
the expense of people buying a house and anticipating it's going to have like a 30. I mean, I live in New York, so obviously like skewed as to what happens with housing. But there's been this perspective over the past, 20 years or so, that like you buy a house and this is like you're buying, it's better than a lottery ticket on some level. Like this is going to increase at like 12% a year or something. And that just won't happen, but it'll still be cheaper maybe than renting in some instances.
Well, so I think what's going to happen is it's not going to increase at 12% a year, but it might increase at 10% a year. The house you buy will be the market will make it a little cheaper because the federal check, the federal subsidy won't be there on the high end as much. So that's where the impact is going to occur. There's going to be zero. It's not going to affect construction jobs at all. It's not going to affect the number of real estate agents or mortgage brokers at all. It may well be, though, that those that sell homes at the high end are going to pay a bit of the price, and they've been benefiting for decades now because of the way the tax code advantages the wealthy on this. So I'm not about that. It's not going to cost. I don't think it's going to cost any jobs in that sense. But there are stakeholders who are going to imagine, and some rightly so, that their incomes are going to be impacted a bit, but not the jobs. And I will. I've not done. I don't have all the information yet. But the state of Oregon had before it, and still does, a reform proposal to reform the state pass-through on the mortgage interest deduction, and it has generated a lot of opposition from the real estate industry and from some of the other stakeholders in it that are lessons for how to frame and narrate a reform and repurposing on this. What we need is, we've got $150 billion of public investment in there, and we need a shift in our portfolio investment. And see how I got around saying the word redistribute there?
Well, it's not such a bad word around these parts, but I understand the trepidation. All right, so one more. Give me one more sort of top line.
All right, so yeah. So this is, I don't want to say 30,000 foot high, but this is really macro equity. We're talking about the mortgage interest deduction. I'm of an age, and I've been, fighting these battles long enough that if I'm going to fail, it needs to, in my mind, it's got to be a heroic failure. So I'm going at the biggest pot here. But I also want us to think real seriously about individual families and their mobility and how much smaller amounts can be big changes in their lives. So another favorite of mine is a program called Family Self-Sufficiency. And those that are not familiar with family self-sufficiency, it works in the following way. Those families receiving rent subsidies or in public housing pay the amount of rent based on their earnings. The more your paid earnings go up, the higher your rent goes. So there's a disincentive of sorts here. What family self-sufficiency does for those in the program who successfully completed at the end of 5 years, instead, and I'm going to oversimplify, but this is the way it works. Instead of your rent going up, when your paid earnings go up, and that's the key. It's a work inducement program at the end of the day. When your paid earnings go up, your rent won't go up. Instead, that money is put into an escrow account with your name on it. So, and that account can be large. We evaluate one of the programs here in the New England area, and within the first 3 months where we started looking at this program, one family walked out with a check of $18,000. They walked out of public housing and used that as a down payment on a home in the sort of the Boston metropolitan area, and that may be I don't know how extreme it is, but it's a really good example. And that $18,000, that it was a single mom. She earned that. That was her increase in earnings over the 5 years, and this program is only about 5% of capacity. That is, those enrolled in it, and it's got to be through a local housing authority. I don't want to get overly wonky here, but only about 5% nationally of those that are eligible to be in a program like that are currently in it. And so this is an example of a real, I think, game changer. Potentially.
So just to be clear that I understand it, as your income, if you're living in public housing, as your income increases, you are charged, simply a higher rent, but the balance between what your rent was and what your rent is actually put into essentially a savings account for you.
Yes, an escrow account, okay. But your rent doesn't go up.
Right. Okay.
In lieu of it going up, that money is put into an escrow account with your name on it.
But you do pay the money from your income.
No.
So wait.
No, the money that goes into that is from Department of Labor, I believe. It's the department where the program is housed.
So it is a payment that is equivalent to what the rent increase would be?
Yeah, so the housing authority gets the increase in rent, but you actually don't pay the increase.
And it's tax dollar program?
That's correct.
Okay, I see.
That's correct. I mean, it's real dollars. You know, that check is real at the end of the day for those that complete it.
Great. All right. Well, I think I understand, but that sounds like an interesting program. Well, nevertheless, fascinating research, and I hope that maybe 10 years down the road there'll be another a check-in on these families, because it's fascinating to see that trajectory and sort of overlay that with what we know of national data. Thomas Shapiro, the book is Toxic Inequality: How America's Wealth Gap Destroys Mobility, Deepens the Racial Divide, and Threatens Our Future. Thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and take care.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. Going to take a quick break, head into the fun half of the program, wherein we will have fun half and fun. You can support this program by becoming a member at jointhemajorityreport.com. Jointhemajorityreport.com. Once you become a member, you will be a member. And when you are a member, you'll be supporting this program. You'll be supporting this free part of the program. And then, as a way of saying thank you, we give you bonus material every day that is often as large, if not larger, than the free material. And a different ilk, a little more fun. Still, sometimes some serious stories. Sometimes we have phone calls. The calls that we had yesterday were I would
bizarre.
Say, no, not bizarre. Like in the Pantheon,
no,
right?
We had great calls yesterday.
We had
Ronald
Reagan.
Ronald Reagan, always classic. We had the call.
Did John from San Antonio call?
John with revelations about his clothing habits.
Mindy called. I mean, it was
and then the guy calling in as the Metropolitan Police
Inspector. I thought for a moment
was...
I was going to get arrested. But.
And people also want to know why we didn't have the courage to ask Professor Shapiro about the Seth Rich murder.
We'll get that in the next guest. I know. I chickened out. I was going to call him to court on that. So, folks, there's all sorts of fun, crazy things that happen in the fun half. And you can join us by just joining the Majority Report at jointhemajorityreport.com. Also, justcoffee.coop. Fair trade coffee, tea, or chocolate. Use the coupon code MAJORITY. Get 10% off. Also, if you buy your crap from Amazon or jet.com, you want to support the show, but you don't want to expend anything other than you normally expend, simply go to majorityreportkickback.com. Click through those links. Use them to purchase your goods on those sites, and we get a kickback. Thus, we call it majorityreportkickback.com. 646-257-3920 is the number, 646-257-3920. Programming note, tomorrow on the program, Cliff Schechter and my buddy Larry Murphy. Larry Murphy, the sound of the voice, I should say, of Teddy on Bob's Burgers, and a bunch of other ones. Also, famously, Assy McGee from the show Assy McGee, where if you go to my IMDb page, you'll see that I played the douche on that show. But
You sure did, Rachel.
Larry
you
is
sure
a funny guy
did.
who also very, who's one of those guys who's like constantly texting me now about politics. His utter disgust and loathing of Donald Trump, I think, may be unrivaled. I don't know if he'll express it in the same way as Judy Gold, but it's pretty serious. All right, we got to take a quick break. Be right back after this.
Done